You know, I generally don't like to be Mr. Doomsday. I don't do that as a general rule to get clicks or anything like that, or views. But I want to flag a very serious concern I have about a potential legitimate national crisis that we may be facing because of what happens on Election Day, which is now election week. Now, I'm not going to talk about the good and the bad of who wins and who loses per se, but I want to identify what I consider to be a nightmare scenario on a whole lot of levels that I want you to be aware of, because if this were to play out, I honestly don't know where the country goes, and I think we all need to be ready, whatever that may be, to be ready, but we're going to need to be ready for this potential scenario, which I hope does not come to pass, but we're going to break it down when I come right back. You're not going to want to miss this one. I doubt you'll hear this elsewhere. Hey folks, I'm Mark Smith, host of the Four Boxes Diner, proud American gun owner, constitutional attorney, member of the United States Supreme Court Bar, and author of Israel Disarmed: What the 10/7 Attacks on Israel by Hamas Teach We Americans About the Right to Bear Arms. All right, folks, so we know we have a big election coming up on Tuesday. Hopefully we know what's going to happen on Tuesday night, but I'm pretty sure we're not going to know the outcome. That is somewhat outrageous, but we're not going to get into that here and now. There's a particular scenario I want to flag that is a realistic possibility. I'm not saying it's going to happen, but it's a realistic possibility that could occur. And if this occurs, it's going to trigger a national crisis, in my opinion, of the sort we haven't seen before. So I'm going to tell you what the scenario is. And the scenario is this: that Kamala Harris wins 270 electoral count votes, which means that will be 270 for her to be the next president of the United States. And Donald Trump gets 268. But the problem would be in that scenario, as I'm going to articulate in 1 second, is it will actually give rise to a major set of mistakes that have basically been admitted to by the United States Department of Commerce, overseeing the Census Bureau that conducted the 2020 census. And if the scenario I'm going to paint for you in 1 second plays out, it's going to be a massive problem. And a lot of people are going to be very angry. And I don't know where the country will go if this scenario arises. So let me break down the potential problem and how we got here. Just as a reminder, we elect our president through the Electoral College. Every state is allocated electoral votes. The electoral votes, and listen carefully, are calculated as follows. Every state gets 2 electoral count votes, or 2 electoral votes, because they each have 2 senators. Then they get, listen carefully, then they get additional electoral votes depending on the number of Congress people they have in the state. So if you have a state that has 5 congressmen, let's say, that state would get 7 electoral votes, 2 from the U.S. senators plus 5 for congressmen, for a total of 7. Now you're like, Mark, why does this matter? The reason why this matters is there are 538 total electoral votes that you can get. 538 is the total number of available electoral votes to elect the President of the United States. You need to get 270 to become the next President of the United States. Okay? Now, here's the key and why the census issue is a potential problem. In the year of our Lord 2020, there was a census taken. That census is required to be taken every 10 years under the United States Constitution. Here what I just said, the U.S. Constitution mandates a census to be taken of the entire population, to do an entire count of every person in the United States every 10 years. Based on the 2020 census and every census that occurs every 10 years, those 538 electoral votes I mentioned that are totally available in every presidential election, those get whacked up and allocated to the 50 states. Obviously, there's 2 votes per state because there's always 2 senators. That number doesn't change. But the number of congressmen you get in a given state can change depending on the population of that state relative to other states, for example. Now, here is where the potential problem arises, and then I'm going to paint the scenario for you. It has turned out that the 2020 census conducted by the Census Bureau was not accurate. And this is not me saying it as a conspiracy theorist or anything like that. This is basically conceded by virtue of something the Census Bureau conducts after every census it conducts, called the post-enumeration survey. The post-enumeration survey. And I'll put links to this down below if you want to get super geeky, but I'm going to keep it at a general level. It turns out that under the 2020 census, there were a number of states that were overcounted in terms of the amount of the population they have, meaning they were given more population numbers than they deserved. And some of the red states, like Texas and Florida, were given counts of populations that were below what they should have got, which means what happened is there are more people counted in red states, okay, such as Colorado, Rhode Island, and Minnesota, and fewer population counted than should have been in Texas and Florida. Now, it was so different that this is what an analysis done by Forbes magazine established based on the outcome of the Census Bureau's post-enumeration survey. Here's what Forbes found based on this survey of what should have occurred in terms of the number of congressional seats that were given to blue states and taken away from red states. Here's what Forbes had to say about this, specifically Steve Forbes. The 2020 census looks to be one of the worst ever. It vastly overcounted the populations of certain states, mostly Democratic ones, and significantly undercounted other states, mostly Republican ones. Texas, for instance, may have had as many as 985,000 more people than the official count. New York, by contrast, received as many as 1 million extra people. This affected, listen carefully, folks, this affected the number of congressional seats certain states were allotted. Specifically, Texas and Florida should have each received an additional seat in the House. Rhode Island and Minnesota should each have lost a congressional seat, but did not. Likewise, Colorado was given an additional seat that it did not deserve. Did you hear what I just said? Texas and Florida were denied extra congressional seats, while blue states of Rhode Island, Minnesota, and Colorado got seats that they were not entitled to. And by the way, there's a strong argument that Florida was denied 2 congressional seats that they should have had, and Texas won. That's three House seats. And now again, as I mentioned to you, these House seats give rise to the number of electoral votes a state has, which means that in effect, Texas has 1 fewer congressional seat than it should have, which means it's been denied 1 additional electoral vote than it should have. Likewise, Florida has been denied at least 1 and arguably 2 congressional seats, which means that Florida should have at least 1 and perhaps even 2 additional seats. In contrast, the blue states that are going to vote for Kamala, Colorado, Rhode Island, and Minnesota, all have an electoral vote because they have that extra congressional district that they should not have. Now, I'll put the links to you down below. You can check out my math. But again, the reason why we figured out this mistake occurred is not by virtue of what I did. It's what the Census Bureau actually did by doing these post-enumeration surveys to get and understand how well they counted in 2020. And based on the post-enumeration surveys done by the Census Bureau itself, it's clear that there were some major screw-ups. Okay? You can check out the articles down below. Now, with that said, let me go back to my doomsday scenario. You now understand that there's 2 to 3 congressional seats were taken away from Trump red states and given to blue states. Now, let me just sort of do the Electoral College math under one scenario, and you'll see the potential doomsday problem and how the screw up by the Census Bureau could come back to be a big time problem and cause a lot of people to be extremely angry, and rightly so. Specifically, in a scenario where Donald Trump gets 268 electoral votes by virtue of winning the red states you expect him to win, plus he wins Georgia, North Carolina, Arizona, and Nevada, and he gets 4 votes in Nebraska and 1 vote from Maine because they sort of do kind of weird stuff in Maine and Nebraska. We won't bore you with the details. But again, if he wins all the Sun Belt states and the South, which is, again, Georgia, North Carolina, Arizona, and Nevada, plus 4 votes from Nebraska and the 1 vote from Maine, Donald Trump gets to 268. 268, which means he is 2 electoral votes short of 270. In contrast, if Kamala wins all the to be expected solidly blue states, and she also wins the Midwestern states of Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan, plus she gets a vote from Nebraska and 3 votes from Maine, we need the leftover congressional votes, electoral votes from Maine and Nebraska that, again, those states whack it up a little bit differently. No need to get into the details. But if she gets what's kind of expected from those states, she would get to 270, which means that she will have won the presidency with a 2-vote win over Trump, 270 to 268. But that goes why we now go back to the error made by the Census Bureau in 2020, where they took away 2 seats, 1 to 2 seats from Florida, and at least 1 seat from Texas, giving 3 seats to Colorado, Rhode Island, and Minnesota. Obviously, you don't need to be an intellectual giant or a math whiz to realize that simply swapping out a seat, giving Texas 1 additional seat, which they're entitled to, and Florida at least 1 additional seat, which they're entitled to based on the post-enumeration survey done by the Census Bureau. That moves, in the scenario I just outlined, Donald Trump from 268 electoral votes to 270 by virtue of the fact that Texas would have the additional vote from the additional congressional district, and Florida would have at least 1 additional vote from the additional congressional. And that alone moves Donald Trump to 270 and Kamala Harris back to 268, maybe 267, depending on how you want to view that extra seat, that second seat in the context of Florida, which I think is probably 2 seats for Florida they were denied and 1 seat from Texas denied. So with that said, if this occurs, what this will have taught us is that the Census Bureau, you can label it deep state, you can label it the unelected bureaucrats, whatever you want to call it, I leave it up to you, but you can see that if this scenario plays out, people are then going to start really looking at the Electoral College as articulated by the 2020 census versus the post-enumeration survey and the screw-up that apparently undeniably occurred here by the Census Bureau that cost the red states these congressional seats and, by extension, those electoral votes. As to what happens in this scenario where it will appear to many Americans that something the Deep State Census Bureau did in error and conveniently in favor of the deep state supporting blue state Democrats, Kamala Harris types, one can easily see arguments being made that the election of Kamala winning 270 to 268 is not legitimate. Now, again, I'm not taking a position on this right here, right now. I'm articulating a scenario that I want you to be aware of. Because if the scenario were to play out, and I, God forbid, hope it does not play out, I do not want this to play out. This would be very bad for the country for a whole host of reasons. If this gets played out this way, I think you all got to be ready and be aware that there's going to be some very upset people with what went down in that scenario. And again, I'm not saying what should happen or what shouldn't happen or what's good or bad. I'm just telling you that if the scenario plays out, I don't know how people will react and where the country goes, because it will be such a mess. Obviously, if it turns out that mistakes made by the Census Bureau in 2020 doing the census cost President Trump the presidency, it will be a problem. And I think you know why. And I think you can see how this could be a problem. Okay? So anyway, again, I'm not a doomsday guy, but I try to be realistic. I try to bring you the real world. You know, that's my style. Good, bad, and ugly. And again, I'm not cheering for what I've just described, but I want you to be aware of it because I do think this is a scenario that theoretically could occur. And if this occurs, I just don't know what's going to happen. So, word of the wise. Okay, folks, well, hope you learned something here today. Make sure you follow me on X at @4boxesdiner. Don't forget to like this video and share it with your friends on social media and help me out on that. And I appreciate subscribing to this channel. We're trying to get to 200,000 subscribers, working hard at that. And again, we'll look forward to seeing you very soon here at the 4 Boxes Diner.
Orders up. Table 2A.